"Don't you dare touch that safe, Natalie." My stepmother Barbara's voice cut through the air like a knife as I stood in the doorway of her bedroom. I had just walked in from my father's funeral, still wearing my black dress, my eyes swollen from crying. She was crouched in front of the wall safe, her fingers moving quickly across the keypad, changing the combination. 20 relatives were downstairs having coffee and sharing memories of my dad, but here she was, securing her treasure before his body was even cold. "I was just looking for Dad's reading glasses," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted me to have them." Barbara stood up and turned to face me, her eyes cold and hard. "You mean you were snooping around for money? That's all you've ever cared about? You're greedy, Natalie. Just like your mother was before she left." Her words stung like acid on an open wound. Several relatives had followed me upstairs and now stood in the hallway, witnessing my humiliation. My cousin Andrew looked away uncomfortably while Aunt Helen shook her head in disapproval, though I couldn't tell if it was directed at Barbara or at me. "My name is Natalie Foster, and I'm 34 years old from Columbus, Ohio." Before I continue with this story that changed my life forever, please subscribe to this channel for more fascinating stories like this one. You won't believe what happens next. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the safe and Barbara's panic when she saw me near it. Why would she change the combination on the day of Dad's funeral? What was she so desperate to protect? I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars Dad had helped me stick on the ceiling when I was 8 years old. Then I remembered something. Years ago, when I was 16, Dad had shown me a hiding spot in my closet. He had pressed on a loose board and revealed a small space behind it. "Just in case you ever need to keep something safe from prying eyes," he had said with a wink. I had forgotten all about it until now. I got out of bed and went to my closet, running my hands along the back wall until I found the board that gave slightly under pressure. I pushed it aside and reached into the darkness. My fingers touched something cold and metal. I pulled it out and stared at it in disbelief. It was a key, small and silver, with a number engraved on it. The next morning, I examined the key more carefully. The number engraved on it was 2847, the same number as our old street address on Maple Drive, where we had lived before Dad married Barbara. This wasn't just any key. This was deliberate. Dad had left this for me specifically, hidden where only I would think to look. But what did it open? I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the cool metal warming against my skin. That's when I noticed something else. There were tiny scratches on the key, forming letters. I held it up to the light and squinted. The letters spelled out safe. My heart started pounding. Dad had left me a key to the safe. But how could that be? The safe in Barbara's bedroom had a digital keypad, not a keyhole. Unless there was another safe. I thought back to all the places Dad used to spend time. His office. The garage. The basement. Then it hit me. The storage unit. Dad had rented a storage unit years ago to keep some of his important documents and family heirlooms. Barbara had never bothered with it because she considered it full of junk. I drove to the storage facility on the edge of town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The manager, an elderly man named Frank, recognized me immediately. "Natalie, I'm so sorry about your father. He was a good man. Always paid his rent on time and never caused any trouble." I thanked him and asked if I could access my father's unit. Frank hesitated, checking his computer. "Well, the unit is still in his name. Technically, I should wait for the estate to be settled, but since you're his daughter and he spoke about you all the time, I suppose it's okay." He handed me the key to the unit and pointed me toward Building C. My heart was racing as I walked down the narrow corridor between the metal storage units. Number 2847. There it was. I inserted the facility key into the padlock and pulled open the rolling door. Inside was mostly what I expected. Old furniture, boxes of books, some of Dad's golf clubs. But in the back corner I saw it. A small floor safe, the old-fashioned kind with a keyhole. I pulled out the silver key and inserted it. It turned smoothly. Inside the safe was a sealed manila envelope with my name written across it in Dad's shaky handwriting. For Natalie, open only after I'm gone. The ink was faded, suggesting it had been written years ago, maybe even before I got married and moved away. I sat down on an old chair and stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal and pulled out several sheets of paper. The first page was a letter dated 5 years ago, right around the time Dad's health had started declining. "My dearest Natalie," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer able to protect you myself. I'm writing this because I need you to know the truth about Barbara. I've tried to tell you before, but she's always there, always watching, always controlling what I can and cannot say. I fear she's been stealing from me for years, and I believe she may be manipulating my medication to keep me weak and confused. Please forgive me for not being stronger. Please forgive me for letting her drive a wedge between us. You need to protect yourself now. The evidence is scattered, but it's there if you know where to look." I sat in that storage unit for over an hour, reading and rereading Dad's letter until the words were burned into my memory. He described how Barbara had gradually taken control of his finances, his medical care, and his relationships. He wrote about how she had convinced him to push away old friends, how she had monitored his phone calls, how she had made him dependent on her for everything. "She's been telling people you're unstable," the letter continued. "She's been planting seeds of doubt about your character and your intentions. She knows that if I die and you challenge her control of my estate, no one will believe you because she's spent years making sure they see you as the greedy, troubled daughter who only shows up when she wants something." My stomach turned. I thought back to the last few years and how relatives had started treating me differently. How conversations would stop when I entered a room. How invitations to family gatherings seemed to dry up. I had blamed myself, thinking I was too busy with my own life, too absorbed in my failing marriage to notice I was being pushed out. But it wasn't me at all. The letter mentioned my ex-husband, Trevor. "I'm sorry about what happened with Trevor," Dad wrote. "I know Barbara got to him. I heard her on the phone with him several times, feeding him stories about how you were taking my money, how you were trying to control my medical decisions. She knew he was struggling with his business, and she offered to help him, to invest in his company. All she asked in return was that he keep an eye on you, that he report back to her about what you were doing and saying. When you started asking questions about my health and my finances, she told Trevor you were becoming paranoid and obsessive. She drove the wedge between you two deliberately." I felt sick. My marriage to Trevor had fallen apart 3 years ago, and I had never fully understood why. One day we were happy, making plans for the future, and the next he was distant, suspicious, accusing me of things that made no sense. He said I was too focused on my father's money, that I was using him to get access to Dad's estate. When I denied it, he called me a liar. We divorced within 6 months, and I lost almost everything in the settlement. Now I understood why. The letter directed me to look for more evidence, and I spent the next week quietly searching through Dad's papers. I obtained copies of the probate records from the county courthouse, claiming I needed them for tax purposes. What I found made my blood run cold. Dad's will had been changed 4 weeks before his death. The original will, written 10 years earlier, left everything split evenly between me and Barbara, with specific provisions ensuring I would inherit his collection of rare books and his mother's jewelry. The new will left almost everything to Barbara. My name appeared only once, in a clause that gave me a small cash payment of $5,000 and any personal items she wishes to claim, subject to Barbara's approval. I compared the signatures on both wills. Something looked wrong. The signature on the recent will was shaky and uncertain, not like Dad's usual confident script. I remembered that during those final weeks, Dad had been heavily medicated for pain. He slept most of the day and was often confused when he was awake. Could he have even understood what he was signing? I took both wills to my friend Vanessa, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. She had helped me during my divorce and was one of the few people who hadn't believed Barbara's stories about me. Vanessa studied the documents carefully, comparing the signatures, checking the dates and witness information. "Natalie, this doesn't look right," she said after 20 minutes of examination. "See how the signature on the recent will is different? The pressure is inconsistent. The letters are malformed. This looks like someone who is either heavily medicated or being guided by someone else's hand. She pointed to several irregularities. The witnesses listed on the recent will were Barbara's friend Diane and a notary named Thomas Perry. Vanessa looked up the notary's information and found something interesting. Thomas Perry had his license suspended 2 years ago for notarizing documents without properly verifying the signer's identity. This could invalidate the entire will, Vanessa said quietly. If we can prove your father wasn't in a proper state of mind or that the document was improperly notarized, the court would have to fall back on the previous will. I knew I couldn't confront Barbara directly. If she suspected I was building a case against her, she would destroy any remaining evidence and turn the entire family against me even more than she already had. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to make her think she had won. So I became compliant, docile, defeated. When Barbara called and asked me to help her pack up Dad's belongings to prepare the house for sale, I agreed immediately. I'm glad you're finally being reasonable about all this, she said with barely concealed satisfaction in her voice. Your father would want us to move forward without conflict. I spent 3 weekends helping her sort through Dad's things, boxing up his clothes for donation, packing his books, taking down his photographs. The whole time, Barbara made little comments about how I was finally knowing my place and accepting reality. You know, Natalie, this is probably for the best, she said while we were folding Dad's sweaters. You never really understood your father's wishes anyway. He told me many times that he worried about your judgment, especially after that messy divorce. I bit my tongue and nodded, playing the part of the broken daughter. But every time I was alone in a room, I was taking pictures of documents, copying serial numbers from valuable items, and making notes of everything that was disappearing. While Barbara thought I was beaten down and compliant, I was actually rebuilding my life. I had been living off savings and occasional freelance work since the divorce, but I needed financial independence if I was going to fight her properly. I applied for jobs and got hired as an office manager at a marketing firm across town. The pay was decent and the hours were stable. I opened a new bank account that Barbara knew nothing about and started saving every penny I could. I also began reaching out to family members who had been pushed away over the years. Dad's brother, my Uncle Raymond, had stopped coming to family gatherings 5 years ago after a fight with Barbara. I called him and we met for coffee. Your father and I were close until Barbara came along, Raymond told me sadly. She convinced him I was trying to borrow money, that I was jealous of his success. None of it was true, but your dad believed her. I tried to maintain a relationship with you, but Barbara made sure we couldn't talk privately. I'm sorry I didn't try harder. I told him what I was discovering, and his face grew serious. I'll testify to whatever you need, he said firmly. Your father deserves justice, and so do you. Uncle Raymond connected me with someone who turned out to be crucial to my case. Her name was Patricia, and she had been one of Dad's nurses during his final months. Patricia had left her job at the home care agency shortly after Dad died, and she was willing to talk. We met at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town where no one would recognize us. I'm glad you reached out, Patricia said, stirring sugar into her coffee. What happened to your father has been weighing on my conscience. She told me that Barbara had been constantly interfering with Dad's care. She would adjust his medication schedule without consulting the doctors, claiming she knew what was best for him. She restricted visitors, telling Patricia that Dad was too tired or too confused to see anyone. Most disturbing of all, Patricia had witnessed Barbara coaching Dad on what to say to doctors, pinching his arm when he tried to contradict her version of events. I reported my concerns to my supervisor, Patricia said quietly. But Barbara was very charming with the agency. She brought them gifts and praised their service. My complaints got brushed aside as a personality conflict. Then Patricia pulled out a folder from her bag. But I kept my own records. Every time I witnessed something questionable, I documented it. Dates, times, what was said and done. I never threw them away because I had a feeling they might be needed someday. Patricia's records were damning. She had documented dozens of incidents over the course of 6 months. Notes about Barbara giving Dad pills that weren't on his medication chart. Records of visitors being turned away at the door, including Uncle Raymond and several of Dad's longtime friends. Detailed observations about how Dad would be alert and conversational when Barbara wasn't in the room, but would become confused and withdrawn when she returned. There was one entry from 4 weeks before Dad's death that made me catch my breath. Patient appeared agitated today. Kept saying he needed to change something important, that he had made a mistake. Barbara sent me to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription that could have waited. When I returned 2 hours later, patient was heavily sedated and there was a man in a suit leaving the house with a briefcase. Barbara said it was just their financial advisor. The date matched the date on the revised will. I called Vanessa immediately and read her the entry. "We need to get the hospital records," she said. If Barbara was administering unauthorized medications, there should be evidence of that in his blood work and medical charts. This might be more than just financial manipulation. This could border on criminal negligence or even worse. Getting the hospital records wasn't easy, but with Dad's old attorney's help, we were able to obtain them through the probate process. What we found supported everything Patricia had documented. Dad's medical charts showed unexplained fluctuations in his medication levels. Several times, the attending doctors had noted concerns about patient confusion possibly related to medication interactions and had recommended adjusting his prescriptions. But the medications were never adjusted because Barbara had convinced the home care agency that the doctors were being overly cautious. Around this time, Barbara started noticing changes in my behavior. I had stopped being as available to help her pack up the house. I was working full-time and rebuilding my social connections. I was standing straighter, speaking more confidently. One evening, she called me and her voice was sharp with suspicion. "You've been acting strange lately, Natalie. What are you up to?" I forced myself to sound casual. "Nothing, Barbara. I just got a job and I'm trying to move forward with my life, like you suggested." "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "I think you're plotting something. I want you to know that if you try to cause problems for me, I have documents showing your father's concerns about your mental stability. Letters he wrote about your behavior. Witnesses who will confirm you were unstable and greedy." Barbara's threats made me realize I needed to move faster. If she suspected I was building a case, she might destroy evidence I hadn't found yet. The next weekend, when she thought I was at work, I drove past Dad's house and saw her loading boxes into her car. I parked down the street and watched. She drove to a dumpster behind a shopping center and started throwing boxes away. After she left, I waited 10 minutes and then approached the dumpster. I climbed up and looked inside. There were boxes of Dad's papers, old photo albums, and files from his office. I pulled out as much as I could and loaded it into my car. At home, I went through everything. Most of it was junk, old tax returns, and utility bills. But in one box, buried under a pile of receipts, I found a USB drive taped to the bottom. I plugged it into my laptop with shaking hands. The drive contained financial spreadsheets going back 7 years. Transaction records, bank account information, detailed logs of withdrawals and transfers. Dad had been keeping track of everything. The spreadsheets showed over $300,000 that had been transferred from Dad's accounts to accounts in Barbara's name over the years. Small amounts at first, just a few thousand here and there. But as Dad's health declined, the amounts had grown larger and more frequent. There were also transfers to her friend Diane and to several businesses that I couldn't immediately identify. This was the evidence we needed. With Patricia's testimony, the medical records, the suspicious will, and now the financial records from the USB drive, Vanessa convinced her boss to take my case. His name was Arthur Bennett, a respected estate attorney who had handled some of the biggest probate cases in the state. Arthur reviewed everything we had gathered and nodded slowly. "This is substantial," he said. "We have grounds to challenge the will based on undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. We can also potentially pursue claims for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." He explained that the process would be difficult and expensive. Barbara would fight back with everything she had. There would be depositions, court hearings, and probably a trial. My name would be dragged through the mud. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Dad's letter, about the years of manipulation and lies, about how Barbara had destroyed my marriage and isolated me from my family. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm prepared." Arthur filed the petition to set aside the new will and opened an investigation into Barbara's handling of Dad's finances. The court papers were served to Barbara on a Tuesday afternoon. Within an hour, my phone started ringing with calls from relatives who had heard the news. Barbara's response was swift and vicious. She immediately began a campaign to destroy my reputation completely. She called everyone in the family and told them I was mentally unstable, that I was making wild accusations because I couldn't accept that Dad had chosen to leave his estate to her. She told her church community that I was a troubled woman who was trying to profit from my father's death. She even contacted my employer, telling them they should be careful about trusting me with company finances because I had a history of erratic behavior and delusions about money. Several relatives called me, their voices full of disappointment and concern. "Natalie, what are you doing?" my cousin Beth asked. "Everyone knows you've been struggling since the divorce. This is just making you look worse." Aunt Helen was more direct. "Your father would be ashamed of you, dragging his name through the courts like this. Barbara has been nothing but kind to you, and this is how you repay her." I tried to explain that I had evidence, that Dad had left me a letter warning me about Barbara, but no one wanted to listen. Barbara's version of events was simpler and fit their existing beliefs. I was the troubled daughter. She was the devoted wife. Why would they believe me? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Patricia, the nurse who had kept records, reached out to several other caregivers who had worked with Dad over the years. 3 of them agreed to give statements. They all told similar stories about Barbara's controlling behavior and her interference with Dad's care. Then Uncle Raymond found 2 of Dad's old friends who had been pushed away during the final years. One of them, a man named William who had known Dad since college, told a story that made even Arthur Bennett pause. About a year before Gerald died, he called me late at night. William testified in his deposition. He was crying, which I'd never heard him do before. He said Barbara had him trapped, that she controlled everything, even his medication. He said he'd tried to change his will back, but she'd found out and hidden his phone, so he couldn't contact his lawyer. He begged me to check on Natalie, to make sure she knew he loved her. When I tried to visit the next day, Barbara wouldn't let me in the house. The depositions and statements started to paint a clear picture. Multiple witnesses describing the same pattern of control, isolation, and manipulation. Even some of Barbara's own friends began to distance themselves when they realized the weight of evidence against her. The day of the first major court hearing arrived. I wore a simple navy suit and tried to look calm and composed, even though my stomach was churning with anxiety. Barbara sat across the courtroom with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Karen Mills who specialized in defending difficult cases. The judge, an older woman named Judge Patricia Hartley, had a reputation for being thorough and fair but not suffering fools gladly. Arthur presented our case methodically, introducing Dad's letter first. He handed a copy to the judge and asked permission to read it aloud. As Arthur read my father's words in the silent courtroom, describing his fears and his love for me, I watched Barbara's face. For the first time since this all began, I saw her mask crack. Her confident smirk faded. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. When Arthur finished reading, Judge Hartley looked directly at Barbara. "Mrs. Foster, this is a very serious accusation from your late husband. Do you have any explanation for why he would write such a letter?" Barbara's attorney objected, saying the letter was hearsay and couldn't be verified. But Judge Hartley overruled her. "The letter is signed, dated, and found in a location consistent with Mr. Foster's described actions. I'll allow it as evidence. I'm also ordering an independent forensic examination of all financial records and medical documentation. This court will not rush to judgment, but we will get to the truth." The independent forensic audit took 6 weeks. A team of accountants and medical experts combed through every document, every transaction, every medical note. Their report was over 200 pages long, but the conclusions were damning. The financial forensic team found evidence of systematic fund diversion totaling over $380,000. They traced money flowing from Dad's accounts into Barbara's personal accounts, then into various investments and purchases that benefited only her. The medical experts concluded that Dad's medication regimen during his final months was highly irregular and not consistent with standard care practices, and that the patient appears to have been maintained in a state of reduced cognitive capacity through a combination of over-medicating and medication interactions that should have been identified and corrected by proper oversight. When the report was presented to Judge Hartley, she called for an immediate hearing. Barbara's attorney argued that the findings were circumstantial and that Barbara had only been trying to help her husband. But Arthur had one more card to play. He called Thomas Perry, the notary who had witnessed the revised will, to testify. Under oath, Thomas admitted that he had been friends with Diane, Barbara's friend, and that Diane had paid him $500 to notarize documents without properly verifying my father's identity or competency. After the hearing with Thomas Perry's devastating testimony, Barbara's attorney requested a private meeting in the judge's chambers. I wasn't allowed to attend, but Arthur filled me in afterward. Barbara had tried to negotiate a settlement. She offered to return half of the estate to me if I would drop all claims and agree not to pursue any criminal charges. Arthur had looked at her attorney and said simply, "No. Mrs. Foster committed fraud, financial exploitation, and possibly worse. My client wants full restoration of her rights under the original will, and we will leave the question of criminal prosecution to the district attorney's office." 2 days later, Barbara tried a different approach. She called me directly, her voice shaking with what might have been genuine emotion or calculated manipulation. "Natalie, please," she said. "We can work this out between us. I loved your father. Everything I did was to protect him and keep him comfortable. I know how it looks, but you have to understand, I did it all out of love." I thought about Dad's letter, about Patricia's documentation, about the years of lies and manipulation. "Barbara," I said quietly, "if you loved my father, you had a terrible way of showing it. You controlled him, isolated him, and stole from him. That's not love. That's something else entirely. You're going to ruin me," she said, and now her voice was hard and bitter. "Is that what you want? Revenge?" "No," I replied. "I want justice. There's a difference." Judge Hartley's final ruling came 3 weeks later. The courtroom was packed with family members, reporters who had started covering the case, and several lawyers who were interested in the legal precedent it might set. I sat next to Arthur, my hands folded in my lap, trying to breathe steadily. Judge Hartley entered, and everyone stood. When she sat down and began reading her decision, the room fell completely silent. This court finds that the will dated 4 weeks before Gerald Foster's death was executed under circumstances that indicate undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity, she began. The evidence presented shows a clear pattern of manipulation and control. The testimony of medical professionals, caregivers, and the forensic analysis of Mr. Foster's cognitive state at the time of signing lead this court to conclude that the document does not reflect his true wishes. She continued, detailing her findings, and then delivered the conclusion I had been hoping for. Therefore, this court sets aside the contested will and reinstates the previous will dated 10 years prior. The estate shall be distributed according to those terms. Additionally, this court is referring the matter of financial exploitation to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation. Barbara made a choking sound and her attorney had to steady her. I felt tears running down my face, but I wasn't sure if they were from relief, grief, or exhaustion. The social consequences for Barbara came swiftly. Within days of the judge's ruling, her church community learned the full details of what had happened. The same people who had rallied around her when she claimed I was a troubled daughter now saw her as a manipulator and a thief. Her friends stopped calling. Her invitations to social events dried up. Her book club asked her not to return. Even Diane, her close friend who had been complicit in some of the schemes, publicly distanced herself, claiming she had been misled about the situation. Barbara had to sell Dad's house to pay legal fees and begin returning the money she had stolen. She moved into a small apartment across town. Her comfortable lifestyle, built on my father's wealth and generosity, was gone. The isolation she experienced was a mirror of what she had done to my father and to me. I heard through relatives that she spent most of her time alone, that she looked years older, that she had become bitter and withdrawn. Uncle Raymond called me one evening. "I saw Barbara at the grocery store today," he said. "She looked right through me, like I wasn't there. She's lost everything. Her money, her friends, her reputation." I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost?" I asked. "Almost," he confirmed. Then I remembered what she did to my brother. 3 months after the court's ruling, I was leaving my office when I saw Barbara's car pull up in the parking lot. My heart started racing and I considered going back inside, but she had already seen me. She got out of her car and walked toward me. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her expensive clothes had been replaced by ordinary department store outfits. Her perfectly maintained hair now showed gray roots. "I need to talk to you," she said. Her voice was different too, less commanding, almost pleading. We stood by my car, and she began speaking rapidly, words tumbling out like she had been rehearsing them for weeks. "You've ruined my life, Natalie. You've destroyed everything I worked for. I gave your father the best years of my life. I took care of him when he was sick. And this is how you repay me? By taking everything away." I looked at her and felt surprisingly calm. "Barbara, you didn't give Dad anything. You took from him. You took his money, his autonomy, his relationships, and his dignity. You isolated him from everyone who loved him. You manipulated his medication to keep him weak and confused. You committed fraud and theft. I didn't ruin your life. You did that yourself." She stared at me, tears running down her face. "I hope you're happy now," she said bitterly. "I hope destroying me was worth it." I got in my car and looked up at her through the window. "This was never about destroying you, Barbara. It was about honoring my father and protecting what was rightfully his to give. You wrote your own, ending the moment you decided to betray him." I drove away and never looked back. 6 months after everything was settled, I visited Dad's grave on a cool October morning. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind in the trees. I sat down on the grass next to his headstone and pulled out his letter, now worn from being read so many times. "Dear Dad," I said softly, "I did what you asked. I protected myself. I found the truth. And I made sure Barbara faced consequences for what she did to you." I told him about the court case, about Judge Hartley's ruling, about the money that had been returned to the estate. I told him about reconnecting with Uncle Raymond and his old friends. I told him about my new job and how I was rebuilding my life with confidence and purpose. "The hardest part," I said, "was realizing how much time we lost, how Barbara kept us apart during those final years when we could have been close. But I understand now that you were trying to protect me in the only way you could, by hiding that key, by leaving those records, by writing that letter. You were still fighting for me even when you couldn't fight for yourself." I stood up and brushed the grass from my jeans. The sun was breaking through the clouds, and everything felt clearer somehow. I was financially stable now, with Dad's inheritance properly restored. I was emotionally healed, surrounded by family members who finally knew the truth. And most importantly, I was living on my own terms. Barbara was just a memory now, a cautionary tale about what happens when greed and manipulation become someone's entire identity. As I walked back to my car, I felt Dad's presence somehow, a gentle warmth that told me he was proud. The letter had set me free, just as he had intended. And I was finally, truly free.